The question landed so quietly in courtroom 4B that Peter Lowell's papers sounded louder when the judge looked down and said, "Explain the 52000 founder shares." Graham Talbot stopped breathing beside his attorney, and the confidence that had carried him through 14 months of depositions left his face so fast it almost looked staged. I kept my hands folded on the table, my navy sleeve brushing the edge of the exhibit binder, because that binder had more truth in it than my husband had shown me in years. Behind Graham, Sienna Vale sat in a pale ivory suit that was too polished for a divorce hearing and too bridal for anything that still had dignity. She had come to watch me lose cleanly, the way people in our part of Chicago watched a charity auction close, smiling before the number was even read. When the judge lifted the Delaware stock ledger and asked Peter why his sworn disclosure listed Graham as controlling founder, while Exhibit C listed me with the voting block, Sienna's mouth fell open before Peter even stood. Peter tried to recover with the same expensive calm he had used on me in mediation, saying title, leadership, and public record all pointed one way. The judge did not look at Graham's magazine profiles, his conference reels, or the polished biography his firm kept pushing into evidence, because none of that changed a ledger. She tapped the line showing 52000 Class A founder shares under my name, then the line showing Graham with 48000, and the room went so still I could hear fabric shift when Sienna leaned forward. Graham finally turned toward me like a man checking whether a fire was really inside his own walls. And what he found was not panic, not grief, not the wrecked wife he had been preparing to bury. He found me looking straight back at him, and for the first time since he filed, he understood that silence had not meant weakness, only timing. Peter's voice thinned when he said there had to be some mistake in the original formation documents, and the judge answered, "Then your client should not have demanded I enforce them to the letter." Chicago taught people to mistake polish for substance, and in our corner of the Gold Coast, that mistake came wrapped in donor lists, museum dinners, and names printed on heavy cream cardstock. Oraline Verify moved through that world like a prized secret, the kind of company luxury houses wanted near their merchandise, but never fully understood once cameras started flashing. Graham loved that part of it. The velvet rope, the founder interviews, the soft introductions that made him sound like he had built the whole machine with charm alone. What he actually had was my engine running beneath his tailored suits, my image-matching architecture catching counterfeit returns while he smiled across white tablecloths and called it vision. I wrote the product in a cramped apartment near West Loop before there were private car services, before buyer dinners, before anyone in Chicago knew his last name mattered. By the time Oraline Verify entered the rooms where old money inspected new money for entertainment, Graham had learned something dangerous, that if enough people repeated a story, he could start believing it too. Sienna Vale entered through luxury brand partnerships with the precise instincts of a woman who understood that status was easier to borrow than build. She never rushed the affair into the open, because she was smarter than reckless women. And smarter women begin by editing the room before they ever touch the man. My name started disappearing in ways only a founder would notice. First from a product anniversary reel, then from a donor booklet, then from a private investor dinner where Graham thanked everyone except the person who wrote the technology. The gala on Magnificent Mile finished the job with a smile, because Sienna stood beside him in black silk and told one major donor, "Graham built this from nothing," as if I were already dead. I still remember the booklet in my hand, the founder remarks printed under his name alone, the paper thick enough to feel expensive and thin enough to lie. I did not interrupt her. I did not correct him, and I did not leave early, because once I saw my erasure in ink instead of attitude, I knew exactly where to start looking. I did not find them through lipstick on a glass or a hotel charge buried inside a credit card statement, because both of them were too polished for mistakes that ordinary. I found them through a cloud sync conflict on Graham's iPad, the kind of quiet technical error people ignore when they think presentation matters more than infrastructure. The screen refreshed while I was clearing a travel alert, and a shared executive folder opened with Sienna's naming conventions all over it. Clean, glossy, and far too deliberate. There were reservations for Aspen and Napa, jewelry receipts, car service confirmations, and enough private weekend logistics to end a marriage on the spot if humiliation had been my goal. What stopped me cold was not the affair folder, but a strategy deck titled Post Close Image Reset, saved 3 weeks earlier and updated twice that morning. I opened it at the kitchen counter, still in bare feet, and saw my life reduced to bullet points, transition language, wardrobe notes, and a rollout schedule timed around the divorce. Sienna had mapped the sequence with the precision of a campaign launch. Final decree first. Engagement leak, second. Then a couple's profile timed to Graham's next Founder Summit appearance. One slide outlined how I would be described to investors. Private but gracious. No longer active in operations. Proud of the company's continued evolution under new leadership. Another slide proposed curated photographs inside the penthouse. Softer lighting. Less steel. More champagne. Because she understood exactly how quickly people believe a future once it looks expensive enough. I exported the folder, copied the metadata, preserved the file history, and traced each edit through the shared account permissions they had both been careless enough to keep attached. Then I opened an archived capitalization file for Orline Verify, partly from instinct, partly because the woman who built systems inside me still trusted documents more than apologies. The Delaware formation papers loaded in silence, followed by the original stock ledger. And there it was exactly where I had left it. 52000, Class A founder shares under my name. Graham had 48000. The later financing rounds sat in separate layers exactly as structured. And the control block he had been performing in public had never actually been his. I called Martin Keene that afternoon and placed the printed ledger, the deck, and the synced revision history on his desk, and he read long enough for the room to turn heavy. When he finally looked up, he kept his voice low and asked, "Do you want to break the postnup? Or do you want him forced to live inside every word he used against you?" And I told him I wanted the second one. Graham filed for divorce with the efficiency of a man clearing old inventory before a major transaction. And when he slid the postnup across the table, he never once looked ashamed. He framed Orline Verify as his premarital asset, offered me maintenance, the condo, and a neat exit, then leaned back like generosity looked better on him than betrayal. I let him finish, kept my face slack, and watched his hand settle over the signature page as if paper had already done the work. Cruelty started. Martin read the agreement twice in his office, then rested one finger over the language protecting premarital founder shares and said, "If we try to blow this up, they bury us in time." He tapped that same line again, this time harder, and the stock ledger inside my folder made the answer feel less like hope than mechanics. I told him I did not want a dramatic war. I wanted strict enforcement. And once he understood that, his whole posture changed from caution to patience. The mediation sessions took place in rooms built to make expensive people feel reasonable. Glass walls, silent staff, bottled water lined with labels facing outward. Every detail designed to flatter the side, paying more. Peter Lowell used that setting like another weapon, turning every sentence into a polished threat, reminding me how costly discovery could become, how ugly depositions could get, how wise cooperation might look. I lowered my eyes, kept my answers short, and let him mistake restraint for depletion because men like Peter only slow down when they think the floor is solid. Sienna never sat at the main table, which made her cruelty feel even cleaner, because she stayed just outside the room where she could be seen without being accountable. Once, when I walked past the lounge, I caught the edge of her voice telling someone on the phone that some women simply do not know when their season is over. And Graham did nothing to correct it. I gave up the car without argument. Let them keep pieces of furniture they suddenly cared about. And when Martin filed the secondary disclosure near the deadline, Graham signed his demand for strict enforcement so fast he never noticed he was tightening the rope with his own hand. The final hearing did not feel dramatic when I walked in, which was exactly why it frightened Graham, because rooms like that only become dangerous when nobody needs to perform. The judge had already read the filings before we took our seats, and the Delaware stock ledger lay on top of the stack like something too plain to matter until it did. Sienna sat behind Peter Lowell in a cream suit cut sharp enough to suggest victory. But when the judge touched Exhibit C with one finger, even Sienna stopped arranging her face. Peter opened with the same polished certainty he had used for months, calling the settlement fair, the postnup clear, and Oraline, verify my husband's protected premarital property by any reasonable reading. The judge let him finish, then asked why his sworn disclosure identified Graham as controlling founder, when the original charter and ledger, attached to my filing, identified me as holder of 5,2,0,0 Class A shares. Peter tried to pivot to title, public role, management history, and market perception. And the judge cut through all of it with one clean sentence. None of that rewrites a stock ledger. Martin rose without theatrics, which helped more than volume ever could have, and placed the original certificate of incorporation, the founder ledger, and the postnup side by side. He did not argue that the agreement was unfair, coerced, or outdated, because by then, we had already chosen a harder and cleaner road. He told the court we were asking for one thing only: strict enforcement of the exact language both sides had affirmed. And once those three documents sat together, the shape of the truth stopped being negotiable. The judge asked whether I had personally filed the company's original Delaware papers, and when I answered yes, Graham shifted beside Peter like his own chair had turned unfamiliar. She asked why the founder control block had been assigned to me, and I told her the answer lived where it had always lived, in the product architecture, the earliest patent filings, and the training data system I built before we married. Then she asked whether that allocation had ever been superseded by a later signed founder transfer. And Peter looked down at his table because there was nothing there to save him. Graham broke before the ruling did, insisting he had been the CEO, the face, the one investors trusted, as if repetition could convert image into ownership. The judge did not raise her voice when she told him leadership was not the same thing as control, and publicity was not the same thing as title. But his face changed anyway, when she held the postnup up and said, "Mr. Talbot, you asked this court to enforce premarital founder shares exactly as written, and that is precisely what I am doing." I finally understood the court was never rescuing me. It was only refusing to lie for him. The court order reached Helen Burke before gossip did, which mattered because Helen had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that rumor wastes time and documents do not. Outside counsel circulated the ruling, the Delaware Charter, and the founder ledger that same afternoon. And by the next morning, Graham's signing authority was suspended pending emergency review. He stormed into headquarters ready to perform certainty, but the badge access delay at the executive elevator lasted just long enough for everyone in the lobby to understand power had already changed hands. The board session opened 48 hours later with Helen at the head of the table, reading from a memo that used the word governance 5 times and Graham's name only twice. She did not ask how anyone felt. She asked whether the company had entered buyer conversations while control of the founder block had been materially misrepresented. And silence answered before counsel did. When Graham tried to force charisma into the gap, saying operational leadership had always rested with him, Helen glanced at the ledger beside her hand and replied, "Operational leadership is not the issue before this board." I arrived with Martine, the original filings, the product roadmap, And the early patent chain Graham had spent years describing in public as if inspiration had written them for him. Then I placed Sienna's deck on the table, opened to the slide labeled Post-Close Image Reset, and the room changed again because strategy suddenly looked a lot like misuse. Helen read the line describing me as no longer active in operations, turned one page further, saw the planned rollout for a new leadership couple, and told Graham, "You expose this company to governance risk while your executive team prepared personal image materials around a pending divorce and sale." The vote itself was clean, which was more devastating than a shouting match could have been. Because polished rooms do their worst damage when nobody needs drama to finish the work. Graham's officer role was terminated. His authority to negotiate on behalf of Auraline Verify ended immediately, and his minority equity remained exactly what the court had already confirmed. Ownership without control. Sienna was called into a separate meeting with HR and counsel, where the deck, the shared account history, and the company resources tied to her private campaign made her denials collapse under timestamps. What followed looked almost elegant from the outside, which is how upper-tier fallout always travels. Not with screaming, but with absences that begin stacking into a verdict. A host committee quietly revised its spring gala page. A museum dinner seat disappeared from Sienna's calendar. Two women who once air-kissed her at donor lunches walked past her in full daylight and kept moving. When I met the buyer later that week and opened the product architecture on my screen, nobody asked where Graham was, because the answer was already sitting in every document that mattered. They did not lose everything in a single cinematic collapse, which would have been easier to survive, because instant ruin at least gives people one clean story to tell. What Graham and Sienna got instead was slower, colder, and much harder to dress up. A life reduced line by line until only the truth remained. The buyer adjusted its offer for Graham's minority block to match reality. No control premium. No leadership upside. No fantasy attached. Just a discounted number on paper where a future used to be. The penthouse kept billing on schedule. The travel balances matured without mercy. And the event deposits they had treated like props suddenly turned into deadlines. Nobody glamorous enough remained to absorb. Sienna lasted exactly as long as the spreadsheets let her believe Graham might still become the shortcut she had gambled on. And once that hope broke, so did her patience. She left before sunrise with the expensive luggage, the quiet kind that rolls well over stone. And the rings stayed behind on the white kitchen counter like a final correction. Neither of them wanted to speak out loud. Graham called me once after that, not to apologize, not to admit what he had done, but to suggest we speak as adults about stabilizing perception before the market misunderstood things further. I listened to the voicemail in my office, saved it beside the post-close image reset deck, and never returned the call because the sentence itself told me everything I needed to know. He was still trying to manage image after the numbers had already closed around him, still hoping tone could outrun evidence, still performing founder while his name sat lower on every document that mattered. Chicago did the rest the way expensive cities always do. Without noise. Without public cruelty. With doors that simply stopped opening at the same speed. Invitations thinned. Callbacks died quietly. And people who had once leaned across tables to laugh at Graham's stories suddenly developed better things to do with their evenings. By the time Auraline's updated due diligence, materials went out with my name restored to product architecture and founder control. They were not living in the life they had plotted together anymore, only in the version their own paperwork had always described. I kept the condo, changed the lighting, cleared out the pieces that had belonged more to performance than to me, and let the rooms stop feeling like a place where I had been managed. Auraline Verify moved forward under cleaner leadership, quieter branding, and a version of the truth that no longer needed Graham's face attached to it before anyone believed it. The first night I drove north along Lakeshore Drive without checking my phone at red lights. I realized healing was not forgiveness. It was the absence of surveillance inside my own body. Helen invited me to a small dinner with counsel and the buyer after the revised materials went out. And for the first time in years, I sat down under my own name. Nobody introduced me as someone's wife. Nobody softened my role to make a man sound larger. And when product questions came across the table, every answer belonged exactly where it landed. I still keep a framed copy of the original Delaware filing in my office. Not because I need the reminder anymore, but because it deserves to exist in daylight after spending so long buried under his version. Graham left Chicago. Sienna lost the rooms she thought would open forever. Peter Lowell went quiet. Martin finally got the win his discipline had earned. And I kept the company I actually built. If this story stayed with you, thank you for hearing me all the way through. Because sometimes the most human ending is not revenge. It is peace that no longer has to beg for recognition. And if you have ever had to rebuild yourself after being reduced in someone else's story, I hope you find the kind of love, calm, and steady future that never asks you to disappear first.